I wasn't looking for Tartaria when I ran into the dark day of 1780, May 19th, midday in New England and parts of eastern Canada, and the sky doesn't simply dim, it shuts off. Not stormy, not overcast. Black. Midday becomes midnight so fast, people don't have time to argue with their eyes. They just react. Candles get lit at noon. Farmers stop what they're doing because their hands can't find the next tool. Livestock turn around and walk back to their barns, like night has arrived early and nature has issued a command. Inside the Connecticut Legislature, the room gets so dark they adjourn. Not out of politics, not because debate ran out, but because lawmakers literally can't see each other across the chamber. Imagine that. A government meeting stopped by darkness in the middle of the day. No electricity, no phones, no breaking news. Just a black sky pressing down so hard it makes the normal world feel fake. Here's the detail that made me stop scrolling and start collecting sources. Witnesses didn't describe the darkness as something that drifted in the way weather drifts in. They described it arriving like a curtain being pulled, a sudden advancing wall, and at the edge, where the last light fought back, the air carried a copper, brass-colored tint. Multiple accounts mention it, a reddish, metallic boundary where blackness met the remaining day. That's the kind of detail people write down when they're shaken. It's not the kind of detail that politely fits on a museum plaque. If you stay with me, we're going to come back to that copper edge, because it's the hinge in this story. It's the detail that makes the official explanation feel too convenient. Before you decide what you believe, do me one favor. Hold 3 images in your head at the same time. A black noon that shuts down a legislature. A centuries-old map label that fades without a clean explanation. And a wave of monumental buildings that arrive already wearing the same face. If you only hold one of these, the official story feels fine. If you hold 2, you can still call it coincidence. But if you hold all 3, you start feeling the coordination problem. That sense that separate events are moving like gears in the same machine. So when you hear Tartary was just a vague term, notice what that sentence really does. It doesn't only define a word, it turns off the search for a population and continuity. It turns a missing civilization into a dictionary note. That's how erasure works in the softest way possible, not by destroying every artifact, but by changing what people are allowed to call it. Keep that in mind as we go back and forth between the sky, the maps, and the buildings, because the hook of this entire video is simple. If the official story is complete, these 3 tracks shouldn't sync up. If they do sync up, then 1780 isn't a curiosity. It's a marker. The official story is neat. Forest fires, smoke from distant burning woods carried by unusual atmospheric conditions. It's the perfect answer because it closes the file. It turns a terrifying, abnormal event into a local inconvenience with a normal cause. Most people hear wildfire smoke, and the mystery is over. You can file it next to weird weather and move on. But the deeper I went into contemporary reports, the more that neat answer began to crack. Not because smoke can't darken a sky, but because this darkness behaved like something larger than a patch of haze. Timothy Dwight, who later became president of Yale, wrote that the darkness was as uncommon in its appearance as in its depth. Not the slow gathering of clouds, not a gradual settling of smoke. A suddenness that startled people more than the color itself. And then there's the strange sensory layer in multiple accounts. The air felt wrong. Some describe deep rumbling, distant thunder with no storm. Animals didn't just act sleepy, They acted spooked, as if the world's signal had changed, not just the light level. Then night comes, and the moon rises, and it's described as blood red through the haze. If you've ever stood under wildfire smoke, you know what it usually looks like. The sun turns orange, the light feels dirty, the horizon blurs. Sometimes ash falls like snow. Sometimes the sky becomes brownish, dull, drained of blue. Smoke can absolutely create eerie conditions. I'm not denying that. I'm saying these accounts describe a quality of darkness that feels heavier than dirty air. Darkness that arrived fast. Darkness with a colored edge. Darkness that made daily life stop as if a switch had been flipped. And even if you accept smoke as the cause, you hit another problem the moment you ask about scale. Samuel Williams, a Harvard professor who documented the event, estimated the affected area at over 150,000 square miles. That number changes the vibe. Smoke can travel, yes. But this isn't a tiny local story. This is a regional phenomenon with continental reach. When people say forest fires, your brain imagines a source you can point to, a place you could walk to. But an event spanning that much area isn't a campfire narrative. It's the kind of disturbance that makes you wonder what else was happening that we don't include in the simplified version. Because here's the twist. The dark day would still be a fascinating one-day anomaly until you notice where it sits on the timeline. 1780 is not an isolated weird date. In the years around it, you find reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena, darkened skies, red moons, strange haze, ash falling from air that looks clear. Not just in one place, not just on one continent. The late 18th century feels, in the written record, like the atmosphere is misbehaving. And as you widen the lens, another pattern starts whispering from the margins of history. A word that used to sit comfortably on maps begins to fade. Tartary. Tartaria. Call it the label, call it the mystery, but notice the timing. Let me be careful here. I'm not asking you to take a leap into fantasy. I'm not asking you to pick a side. I'm asking you to look at a timing problem and the way official narratives treat timing problems like they're rude. For centuries, European maps used Tartary, or Tartaria, depending on the source, to label vast territories across Central and Northern Asia. The name appears on Dutch maps, French maps, British maps, Russian maps, generation after generation. Through the age of exploration, through the scientific revolution, through the Enlightenment, it's there like France is there, like Spain, like a persistent label that cartographers recognized and reused. And then, in the decades after 1776, after the Declaration of American Independence, after a new nation needs a new story, after fresh beginnings become fashionable, something else happens. The maps change, not in the way maps normally evolve, not gradual corrections, not gentle refinements, not, we finally surveyed that river properly. The label begins to dissolve. Across multiple publishing houses in multiple countries, Tartary starts to disappear. Not with a loud announcement, not with a clear transitional explanation. It just fades. By about 1820, it's nearly gone. By about 1850, it's as if it never existed. The official explanation says, improved knowledge, more accurate designations, proper national and regional names, territories of the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, various khanates and tribal regions of Central Asia. And yes, maps do get refined. Borders change, names evolve. But here's the friction. The 18th century didn't erase centuries-old labels silently. Cartographers were careful about sources. They noted corrections. They argued about revisions. When something big changed, you could usually see the paper trail of that change. With Tartary, the paper trail feels strangely thin. The label doesn't transition so much as evaporate. The name that had sat on maps for centuries becomes a ghost word, and the world is trained to act like it was always meaningless. If you're watching this, you've probably heard whispers of Tartaria. If this is your first encounter, tell me what pulled you in, because people rarely land here by accident. It usually starts with one detail that doesn't match the official label, and then the pattern takes over. Now add the third piece, the one that makes this feel less like trivia and more like a pattern you can see with your own eyes. After 1780, what I've come to think of as an inheritance period begins, roughly 1780 to 1850, when massive, technologically sophisticated buildings appear across the world with suspiciously similar architectural DNA. The official story calls it the neoclassical revival. Europe returns to Greek and Roman ideals, and the style spreads to the Americas, Russia, and parts of Asia in just a few decades. Progress, ambition, the Industrial Revolution, human ingenuity, neat. But the moment you start asking, how exactly? The documentation gets oddly quiet. How does San Francisco, still shaking out of the gold rush, produce world-class Beaux-Arts palaces? How does Melbourne, a colonial outpost, raise exhibition halls that rival European cathedrals? How does Chicago erect an entire exposition city in 2 years with 19th century technology? The official answer is always some variation of, they worked hard and built fast. And sure, people can build astonishing things. But monumental construction leaves a trail. It leaves labor records, supply chains, quarry outputs, transport logs, the messy narrative of delays and accidents and shortages and improvisations. It leaves photographs of scaffolding and cranes and half-finished facades because humans love documenting struggle, not just celebrating completion. Yet what survives, again and again, is often the clean part. Photos of finished structures, dedication plaques, opening ceremonies, official histories written decades later after memory has had time to smooth the edges. The story repeats like a template, completed on schedule despite all odds, built by these unnamed groups of workers, proof of national triumph. The narrative is polished, the gritty middle is thin, and missing middles matter because that's where reality lives. That's where you would expect to find the fingerprints of how. When the middle is missing, it invites a different kind of explanation. Not construction, but reattribution. Not we built, but we claimed. So now, the coincidence stack looks like this. A day the sky turns black at noon, a map label that fades as if it's being erased, and a worldwide wave of monumental architecture that arrives with a strangely consistent look and a strangely inconsistent paper trail. One coincidence is curiosity, 2 is uncomfortable, 3 is where you either stop or you start asking questions that make people nervous. Here's an alternative timeline some researchers propose, stated plainly so you can judge it without hype. Imagine that, before 1780, a global or near-global civilization existed, call it Tartaria or call it something else, organized enough to show up on maps, advanced enough to build the classical-style infrastructure we see standing worldwide, and extensive enough to maintain it across continents. Now imagine that, somewhere between 1780 and 1785, a catastrophic collapse hits, internal war, natural disaster, or something else the official story doesn't name, leaving destruction on a scale large enough to darken skies and disturb climate. After that, From roughly 1785 into about 1820 comes an inheritance phase in which surviving or arriving powers, Russian expansion, European colonialism, American westward movement, Chinese territorial consolidation, move into weakened or emptied regions, claim infrastructure, and reassign origin stories until we built this becomes the only acceptable sentence. From roughly 1820 to 1900, the revision hardens, maps get redrawn, encyclopedias get rewritten, academic consensus locks in, and Tartary is reduced to a vague geographic term. From 1900 to the present, the narrative becomes so solid that questioning it is treated as misbehavior rather than inquiry. Do I know that timeline is true? No, I can't prove it definitively. The evidence is circumstantial, fragmented, and often filtered through retellings. Official history has an answer for everything, even if those answers require a long chain of coincidences and miracles and missing paperwork. But I can ask a hard question. Which explanation requires fewer leaps? Because the standard story has its own faith requirements. It requires us to believe the same monumental style appears across far-flung regions in a tight time window, driven by taste, even as the practical records of construction are thin. It requires us to accept that a centuries-old map label can vanish with minimal transition, as if the world simply agreed it was never important. And it asks us to treat a black midday sky as a curiosity solved by a single word, smoke, without asking why the event felt so different to the people who lived under it. Now let's come back to the dark day, because this is the one piece everyone can agree happened. May 19th, 1780. The sky turns black. The official explanation is forest fires. But when you expand the timeline, the 1780s are loaded with atmospheric weirdness. In 1783, the Laki eruption in Iceland releases what climatologists call dry fog across Europe. 1783 to 1784 brings the Great Frost. 1784 brings widespread crop failures. Through 1785 and 1786, reports describe strange haze, red moons, unseasonable cold. The official story treats these as separate natural disasters clustered by bad luck. Fires here, a volcano there, weather patterns elsewhere. But what if it was one larger disturbance, wearing different masks? What if the dark day wasn't simply smoke from a forest fire, but particulate debris from something bigger? What if the dry fog wasn't only volcanic ash, but a wider atmospheric load from mass destruction? What if the years of abnormal cold weren't random climate quirks, but the kind of aftermath you'd expect when a huge amount of material is thrown into the air? Again, I'm not handing you certainty. I'm handing you a pattern of questions that the neat answer doesn't satisfy. Because if Tartaria was significant enough to sit on maps for centuries, where did it go? Not gradually, not with a slow decline documented in wars and migrations, but abruptly, within a generation. Maps from around 1770 show Tartary. Maps from around 1820 show Russia, China, and European colonial possessions. The transition is fast. The record of the transition is oddly quiet. No widely discussed wars of erasure. No massive refugee narratives. No obvious cultural absorption story at the scale you'd expect. For that to happen, something drastic must be true. Either the label Tartary genuinely was just a vague cartographic bucket that got refined away, or a population large enough to build and maintain continental infrastructure was destroyed, displaced, or scattered so completely that their memory could be overwritten. And if it was overwritten, you'd expect the rewrite to look exactly like what we see. Partial truths arranged into a clean story that satisfies curiosity without inviting investigation. This is why the forest fire smoke explanation feels so perfect. Because it does what good official explanations always do. It's natural, localized, non-threatening, and it requires no further investigation. It turns the dark day into a footnote, not a doorway. It keeps you from asking why the darkness felt like a wall, why the boundary looked copper, why the moon went blood red, why the affected area was so large, why the late 1700s atmosphere reads like a system under stress. And here's the part that makes the silence feel loud. There is no mainstream rush to connect these dots, no academic urgency to ask, what happened to the people behind the map label? No widely celebrated archaeological hunt for a lost continental civilization. No big televised debate over why the cartographic language changed so fast. Instead, there's an almost automatic reflex. It was nothing. It was always vague. It was just a term. Stop being weird. But history isn't supposed to be comfortable. Real history is messy. It has arguments, gaps, contradictions, competing records. When a story becomes too clean, when anomalies are always explained away instantly, it doesn't feel like truth. It feels like editing. So let me put the questions in the simplest possible form, because simple questions are the ones that survive ridicule. Why did Tartary disappear from maps so abruptly across multiple countries in such a tight window? Why is there no clearly documented transition period the way cartographers normally document revisions? Where did the population go, if the label represented anything more than vague geography? Why is there so little mainstream archaeological curiosity around the question? Why do buildings from San Francisco to St. Petersburg share recognizable stylistic structures in the same era? Why are there so few construction photographs compared to the number of monumental projects we're told were built? Why did atmospheric anomalies cluster so dramatically in the 1780s? And the question underneath all of it, the one that haunts me, why does investigating these questions trigger hostility rather than curiosity? Not debate, not let's test it. Hostility. As if even looking too closely is a kind of crime. I started with a black sky. I found what feels like a dark century, an era when something ended and something else began, when cities changed hands, when history was cleaned up, when questions became embarrassing. Was Tartaria a unified empire, a confederation, a technological civilization, a cultural sphere, or simply a cartographic habit? I don't know. The evidence is too scattered to pretend certainty. But stone doesn't lie. The buildings are real. The styles repeat. The maps exist. The dark day is documented. The missing connective tissue, the how and why, is what's strangely absent. Maybe the dark day was forest fires. Maybe rapid construction really was possible. Maybe Tartary really was just a vague geographic label. Maybe, but once you start noticing the timing, it's hard to unsee. It's hard not to feel like we're walking through inherited cities, moving through infrastructure that had a life before our official stories begin. It's hard not to wonder what knowledge was lost, what technology, what understanding of the world, because the architecture remains, and it looks like it belonged to a system, not just an aesthetic. The dark day was May 19th, 1780. The sky went black, and when it cleared, the world's maps began to change. If you've noticed these patterns in your own city, buildings that feel too advanced for their timeline, odd construction gaps, architecture that seems to appear fully formed, write it down before you dismiss it. Compare notes. Because patterns are dangerous for one reason. They let ordinary people verify each other without permission. And that's the hook I can't let go of. Not that someone hid a secret, that someone hid a pattern. Because once the pattern is visible, the questions don't stop, they multiply. And truth doesn't stay buried forever. It just waits for the right questions. This is a narrative-driven exploration, meant for discussion and storytelling, not a verified historical record. And if that copper edge has an explanation we haven't fully faced yet, it might also explain why the maps felt different after the sky cleared. That's the part that keeps returning. Not the darkness itself, but the silence afterward. Newspapers calming everyone down, scientists offering a tidy cause, and ordinary people insisting in their own words. It didn't feel like smoke. If the sky can be rewritten in a day, maybe maps can be rewritten too.